Well, Erin Ganju, thank you so much for taking time to join us here at Luminos. We're excited to have you in this really important set of conversations that we're driving to draw lessons from people's experience as leaders in education and some who have navigated education crisis, to understand what lessons we can pull out for this present crisis with the COVID-19 pandemic that's got a lot of children out of school. And so we thought how wonderful it would be to speak to somebody like you who has both philanthropic funding experience and education implementation experience with Echidna Giving right now and Room to Read previously, and all of the other things that you've done. So we'd love to start, Erin, by just inviting you to tell us a little bit about your story, and we'll take it from there.
Well, thank you. So it is wonderful to be with you and to be able to have this conversation where I hope I can share some thoughts, but also learn from the greater community as we go through this all together. As we all know, we're stronger together. And my background in particular, as you say, is I think interesting because it has some elements of kind of both sides of the equation, of the implementing as well as the funding side. I'm one of the 3 co-founders of Room to Read, which is an international organization focused on education, particularly early literacy and a girls' education program. And I was a CEO and sort of helped grow and establish that organization. And we went through several crises, as you can imagine, over the couple of decades that I was at Room to Read, from a global crises to like the financial crises in 2008 to specific country ones like the Nepal earthquake or tsunami in Sri Lanka and Indonesia, and different ones that we had to manage through. So that gave me some real-time experience as a leader in the sector. And now I'm managing director at Echidna Giving, and it's a wonderful opportunity to stand in solidarity and to find creative and important ways that we can work with our grantee partners in supporting them through a major crisis like this. And I think, as you know, Echidna Giving is a private funder for international education with a gender equity lens to it. And we're really working on how to create that positive ripple effect that girls can have when they're educated and be able to be empowered to make the key decisions over their own lives and contribute to their communities and the world at large.
So, Erin, what's the difference between creating education opportunities during moments of normalcy and doing the same thing during times of crisis?
Well, interestingly, I think one of the things that we think about at Echidna is really the long-term outcomes are not that different, right? We're all, I think, both in our regular work and in a moment like this, looking at how do we create, equitable, just systems that really use education as a powerful tool for change and for progressive change in many cases when we think about supporting marginalized groups to really have full access to quality education in their local communities. And that long-term goal, I don't think has changed. I think that's what we do in our regular work. And I think that's what we do, obviously, in a time of crisis, where in many cases it's maybe more apparent, who are in, more at risk or marginalized groups and how they often suffer more during a crisis like this. You think about girls, right? We've heard a lot about girls are going to be probably dropping out in great numbers when schools reopen. And even at current times right now, the fact that they are perhaps more at risk around domestic abuse or sexual assaults. Teen pregnancies are on the rise in many cases right now. And so there's just a lot of challenges that they are facing that, in a time of crisis. And I think that's, I think that is the big issue, is how do we figure out in a time of crisis, what are maybe the interim, medium-term solutions, not so much changing the goalposts long-term, but what do we need to do now to ensure that we're reaching those groups and providing, holistic services that often schools are doing, in their regular work.
Great. So if girls particularly go through different sets of challenges than boys, what does that mean for everyone in the education value chain, from your classroom teachers and school leaders up through to policymakers? What do they need to be thinking about in terms of creating these situationally specific solutions that deal with gender, and it could be disability, but there are a number of children who are in some different ways marginalized from the education system. Mm-hmm. and you need a response that is agile and responsive to the bespoke needs of each group. How do you pull that together in an education system?
Well, I do think we're big believers at Echidna in having evidence and making, evidence-based decisions. And so there is, a moment now, and I think we're seeing a lot of information being shared through rapid response surveys, right? Of just understanding and contextualizing how this might be showing up for different, age groups or different groups, whether it be girls or children with disabilities or children that are out of school versus in school, all sorts of different ways of thinking about how do we understand the context and what their challenges are. So I do think it's important to make sure that we're getting the right information. For example, at Echidna, we've looked at the fact that a lot of the work around early childhood development is being left out of some of the surveying being done, and trying to help support and understand those early years of kids are so formative. And how do we help parents and children in those years, and not just thinking about only, looking at primary and secondary, age children in some of these surveys. So just a lot of information gathering is important, I think. And then as we look at how do you develop solutions, what we're really big advocates for is making sure that when we collect that data, everything should be disaggregated by gender. So we're thinking about, what is potentially the story or the challenges that you're seeing based on gender. And maybe some of it, maybe there's no difference, and that's important to know as well. If there aren't differences between boys and girls and the challenges they're facing or the risk, but maybe there is. And if you look at some of the access to online education right now, what you are seeing is some in certain countries, girls are being left out in larger numbers and don't have the same access. And so then right there, you're seeing a larger learning loss potentially than for boys. And so how do you get that early data and try to then ensure that a lot of what is going out into the school systems, whether it be through teachers, through WhatsApp and SMS messaging in different ways, are they thinking more about how to reach out to girls and girl families and, providing access for girls? Are they talking to parents about that if they're able to reach them by phone? What can they be doing to try to prevent those, very obvious kind of challenges? I think broader, to your broader question about what do we do in a time of crisis, I think the challenge is that we really do need to be working collaboratively. There's so many duplicative efforts. And so the more that we can be sharing research, sharing data, having conversations with government and, the NGO community and the funders together, so that we're, not all sort of doing small little pilots or studies, but trying to more broadly learn together and pivot in ways that are, helping each other, is so important, because we just don't have the time or the resources to sort of all be in our territorial, silos.
That's helpful. I want to come back to this question of silos and the role, particularly that philanthropy can play in breaking down the walls. But before that, as you can imagine, and well, during times of crisis, one of the things that we do as an international community is come up with big words to cover large areas of thought and study. And so you will have heard people talk about relief, response, recovery, and resilience, and perhaps many other R's. But relief referring to the idea of making sure that kids have access to PPEs and just safety protocols and awareness.
Right.
Talking about response in terms of reacting to the need for learning to continue when kids are out of school. Recovery, as related to the point you just made about learning loss, and how once kids get back to normalized learning, that they're able to recover what's lost. And then resilience, this idea of helping systems become agile, innovative, effective in a way that allows them to sustain and overcome future shocks in a way that allows learning to progress well. So maybe those are great categories, maybe they're terrible ones, but sort of take me through, given your vast experience, take me through each of those buckets and give us a sense of what you think needs to be done in these sort of environments to make sure that we cover all four boxes.
Well, I do think, so if we think about the challenges, and I'm thinking more through my lens now at Room to Read and kind of in the operating role, right? That immediate relief, side is one where, I think you underestimate how much you need to do, and just to make sure your own staff and your own immediate communities, are in a safe place and have gotten through an immediate crisis. When we've, dealt with things like, earthquake or tsunamis, things like that, there is just, it takes a while, and honestly, I think we're probably just getting to the place now where we're moving through that, as a world, but it's taken several months, right? Just for us to all sort of understand what is the new reality, the new norms that we're in, and what are those immediate, needs around safety and education and, hygiene, and in this particular case, hygiene, PPE, things like that, right? So we want to do those things fast, and it always takes longer, is from my experience, as to what it might take to move through that. So I think there's a little bit of patience, and there's a little bit of communication that is really key at those early days about, have you reached out to, all of your staff, your partners, the government, your board, your funders? Does everyone just understand, and have you been able to articulate and communicate clearly with, transparency and as much knowledge as you have of just what the reality of the situation is? That's an important first step, on the relief side, and done what you can do to help alleviate. On the response side, I think, the challenge for many organizations, particularly in education, since this has been more of a health crisis, is to understand, are we in a place to pivot and do something now? Or are we the organization that needs to wait and hold back until later? And I think that's been a challenge. Some organizations certainly are already, we're moving to more online hybrid models, and had the ability to provide, radio content or TV content. And because I'm saying online, very much in the context that we're working in, is not necessarily meaning, computer-based learning, right? It could be other forms that are more realistic and more prevalent in the communities that we're working in. So that, I think, is, some organizations can do that and can do that well, and should, step up in those cases. And I think I've done an amazing job from our grantee of portfolio that we have seen, to be able to contribute and work with the government and align themselves. But not every organization, you don't necessarily want to, every organization to do that, right? Some organizations may be better waiting until schools reopen and using this time to be preparing themselves and doing internal projects or doing other types of work that they can be doing as an organization to be ready for the reopening. Because you don't want them to burn through their resources, whether that be, financial resources, or just burning out their staff time trying to pivot into something that they may not be best suited for. And I think you kind of have to understand as an organization, which category are you in? So that when you are then in that phase of reopening, you do have organizations that are able to say, okay, well, how are we going to, now that we're reopening, we've had X number of months, and of course, in many cases, we don't know how long that is. How do we get back to, trying to ensure that those learning losses are minimized? Are we going to be working at bridging, courses, kind of accelerated learning programs? Like, some organizations are going to be better suited for those types of initiatives, right? And they shouldn't be criticized for not having done something in the interim, because they may be better placed, once schools are reopened. So I just think we all have to sort of think through, like, where are we in that spectrum? And then to the final kind of resiliency and change, system change, to me, that's an area that I think is somewhat the hardest to do, because it does get us back to that, those challenges around silos, and, how do we think about financing? How do we think about, the opportunity to put, together, build back better, as we're all saying, but what is that? How do you really do that? Like, how do we put together systems that are now overwhelmed and, really challenged? I think for education in particular, this will be hard. Obviously, so much of the funding and the focus is on health and, crises and in economic livelihood issues right now. And so what does that mean for education? What resources will we have, and what openness will we have of governments to really think about investing, all that needs to be invested in education, and have the headspace and the mindset, kind of willingness to innovate and be creative in education? I'm worried about that, to be honest. I mean, when we think about how underfunded most of countries are in education already prior to this crisis, and now their budgets are going to be stretched even more, I think it's going to be challenging.
And speaking of budgets and funding, what would you say is the role of philanthropy in times like this?
Well, I think we as philanthropists have to, think about both sides of the equation of both governments and the NGO kind of community of practice that we work in, because I think there are important ways that we can support both of those. And, certainly I think we need to understand and align ourselves with, as we're saying, where governments are and how can we help be thought partners and potentially funders of new and innovative approaches that maybe they're more willing to take now. I mean, I think Winston Churchill had the quote, don't let a crisis go to waste, right? So, are there opportunities now that we are seeing that where governments are willing to experiment and try new things. I mean, we're certainly seeing, for example, in the life skills, social emotional learning space, we've talked, for a long time as an education sector around the importance of, resiliency, problem solving, critical thinking, collaboration. And, governments have sort of said, well, it's all about the academics in many cases, right? And those are important, but secondary issues. And now I think we're seeing a more openness and a willingness to think through, well, maybe we need to focus on this more, because for many of our youth, these are critical skills, as we are seeing in a crisis like this. And if the frequency of crises are, increasing, maybe these are skills we need to think more about. How do we as school systems help reinforce and build those skills in our youth? And so I think those are, potentially some opportunities that we're seeing to really think, surge forward. So those are important conversations to have. I think on the community of practice side, though, as philanthropy, we have an important role to play in ensuring that they have the resources just to manage through this crisis. Because there are, as a sector, they're so vulnerable, I think, in moments like this. And so we as Echidna, for example, have stepped up and done some top-up funding for many of our direct service Global South-based organizations to help them see through this and not lose, incredible staff that they've built, over the years. They are oftentimes paid only by the activities that they implement by some of their, other funding. And so can we help bridge some of those gaps where they, need for their general operating support in order to be able to ride out this? Because what we don't want to see is a lot of great initiatives and programs and organizations not being able to survive a crisis like this. And so I think there is a role for that type of solidarity and support that we play.
I imagine in your career journey, you've engaged with and have watched various ministries of education work their way through crisis, or just working their way through the large questions associated with making sure every child gets a good education. And so what advice might you have today for a minister of education who is either starting their journey and is faced with the immediacy of COVID, or has been on the journey for a while and is still trying to figure out how to drive their education system forward? What advice would you have for them?
Well, I certainly think it's a hard job, as we know, to be in a political position like that. You have a lot of competing priorities, and you have a lot of if you will, bosses, right? That are sort of, you have the, direct political structure you're in, you have a bureaucracy that you're accountable to, and you have the broader community that you're accountable to, right? And so there's many competing priorities that you're struggling with. I think, there are certainly opportunities within a crisis like this, though, to think about when you look at and unpack budgets, are there ways to really work collaboratively with the community of practice in terms of NGOs and private philanthropy to identify areas to ensure that we're really able to work together on? I think this is a time in which we're all going to need to be more collaborative to be able to weather through this storm. I also think this is an important time to think about all the evidence that you already have on your plate. And it's not so much about generating new evidence, I think, in many cases around education. I think it's learning from the current evidence we know exists and using it better. There's a whole sort of philosophy around the science of learning, right? That we actually know a lot, and how can we be using that to help influence and scale up programs. So I think what's challenging is if every new organization comes in with a new pilot and a new proof of concept and a new idea, and that you can drain a lot of resources at that point. And this may be the time to focus on what do we know really works, and what have we seen from current evidence, and how can we work together to really scale up some often, not as expensive, but maybe more around changing, training and systems and allocating priorities, differently within the current size of, the system and the current budgets to be better focused on evidence-based work. That's, I think, an opportunity that many governments are now thinking about.
So high stakes testing. One of the challenges facing governments today is whether or not to get the upper grade kids to hurry up and get back to school so that they can do the test that'll allow them to progress. On the other side, you've got the question of, well, if we don't open schools, what happens to the the kids who are trying to enter grade 1. So if you look at those two issues of access to primary school and making sure that you don't create a bottleneck at the sort of the grade 1 level, all the way through to the big questions around testing and the role that testing has in determining the types of futures people have. Should we be thinking about those two aspects of the value chain differently in moments of crisis?
I mean, those are one of those hard trade-offs. I don't think it's an either or, right? I think it has to be a yes and. I mean, I think we need to do both, right? And I think we're capable of doing both. I mean, I think that we have to focus. Obviously, these gateway exams are huge determinants of children's future, and you whether we like that or not, the reality is that's still where we are right now currently. And we need to ensure that we're able to support kids in being able to take those exams and get through, or we're going to have a generation that will be will suffer. At the same time, we also know that the early years are so instrumental, and that if a child's not learning to read and write and do basic numeracy by third, fourth grade, the rest of their educational life cycle is severely compromised. And so we also don't want to be I think holding children back from those being able to enter school and being able to come back to in those early years, because you're never going to be able to to gain them back once they drop out oftentimes in those early years. And particularly for gender, as we know, you need to start early and breaking gender norms. And so what we're seeing is even first grade is too late, right? We start to form really strong signals that we get by age 3, 4 around gender and gender roles, and what are the social norms that are kind of passed down to us as very young children. And so, we want to be providing supportive systems for parents and for child caregivers in those very early years, and setting them up both academically, in terms of being able to be ready for school, but also around social norm issues like gender, that where they're better served if they're in a program that has a progressive approach to these things, and that will really help us in many ways protect them against the costs of what the future years are if they don't have exposure to more progressive programs in those early years.
I wonder whether there's anything keeping you up at night, whether it's something that you hope will be resolved, or opportunities that you think are being missed in this moment.
The biggest concerns I have are really, as I was sharing, was just concerns around how many nonprofits will be able to see through this crisis. And having been in that role of a CEO of a fast growing educational nonprofit, it is a really challenging job. And I think we as private philanthropy need to be as supportive and as constructive in our support as possible to help see through what is a really stressful situation to be in as a leader. From the crises I managed Room to Read through, as I mentioned, so much of it is about communication and transparency at the beginning, right? And I really encourage leaders to, this is not anybody's fault. No one's expecting any single person to be a hero through this. We are all, being faced with an onslaught of so many different levels of challenges now. I think we have to be really open about where we're succeeding and where we need help. And what I often don't see, enough between nonprofit leaders and funders is enough of that communication around what's working well and what's not working well. I mean, this is hard work, and it's hard work in normal times, much less in a pandemic, right? So we know there's a lot of challenges out there, and how can we keep the lines of communication and trust building to understand what those are, so we know how to help each other see through that? Because, those discussions, it's a dynamic situation. It's constantly changing. And I think, being able to have those conversations are important. And even within an organization, one of the things that we really did often in these crises at Room to Read was we carved out a team that was sort of the crisis management team. And I think that really helped us. And we would put on that team, we looked at it from two different ways. One is who needs to be there to make decisions. So you'd have to have some of your executives, perhaps there was a board, member, or, other people, maybe country staff were often really, if it was, needed the realities and the context of the grounds, maybe there was technical teams, that had particular technical programmatic experience. Like, who needs to be in that room on that crisis team to be able to make quick decisions? And then we had to really focus on how do you execute in this dynamic world when you're constantly getting new. I mean, right now we're all, schools are going to open next month. Now they're not going to open to, 3 months now. Maybe it's going to be, 2021, right? It's just constantly changing. So you're going to have to find ways to pivot even throughout the crisis. And by having that dedicated team, allows you, the rest of your team, to continue doing, you don't want everyone in the organization to be paralyzed by the crisis, right? So you want the rest of your team to really be focused on, and maybe you're assigning them, either specific things they need to do in this crisis, or maybe you're just assigning them internal projects about how to be ready for when the crisis is over. Who knows, right? But you want to keep them on track, and you want, a really, I think, important kind of operational team. Like, it's almost like your war room, right? And politics, oftentimes, you'd have this war room, like who needs to be in that room to be able to make decisions and execute on them and be able to manage through the crisis. And so I think, we need to think of different ways than we normally do our work in order to function through, especially an extended crisis like this. And a lot of that will help, I think, manage through something, that is as long and as lengthy as this is turning out to be.
The existence of a war room, as you put it, in NGOs sort of relies upon, in some ways, the foresight of funders to provide undesignated funding to support activities like that. And I know that we've been on a journey, haven't we, in terms of the perspective that funders have with respect to how much of a portfolio should go towards undesignated funding and supporting an organization versus focused on actual programming. You have a better sort of perspective and vantage point on this question than I do. But what are you seeing now in the funding community with regard to that very distinction between designated and undesignated funding?
I mean, I will say that, perhaps if there are some silver linings in moments like this, and I try to be optimistic and think about, as I was saying, where are those opportunities for maybe changing systems and ways of doing things in moments of crisis, when people are more open and perhaps ready to make bigger leaps or be willing to embrace, creative, innovative ideas. I do get heartened by the fact that many foundations have stepped up in this time to think about, taking the, sort of pledge, if you will, to say, let's think about, general operating support. Let's think about reducing some of the burden on reporting. Let's think about longer term frames in which we're supporting organizations. And really, it's coming down to many of we all see around trust-based philanthropy principles. I don't think it's not, it's not new to this time, but I do see more organizations embracing that. When we invest in businesses, we invest in their stock, and that's like for the whole business, right? We don't say, oh, I only want to fund that one project or that one thing, that one, aspect of the organization. You're investing in the business. And yet we don't think of the same for many nonprofits, right? We think about, we're only going to do this, one component of what they do that we'll fund. And you're like, well, who's funding the rest of it, right? So I think that, deficit mindset, if we have in many cases, where we think that somehow nonprofits are not going to be able to be well run and well managed, and don't understand the realities, I just think it's a false narrative. I mean, I really think that in many cases you see nonprofits on slimmer budgets, on fewer staff, doing heroic activities and managing to be innovative and contextualize in very, relevant ways in country contexts that you don't see often even for-profit companies doing, right? And it's amazing what you can see happen, particularly in a time of crisis. You see how scrappy and how, effective still nonprofits can be in moments like this. And so I hope that gives us more confidence to say, how can we making broader investments in strong organizations and in their general operating support and their health as an organization, not in these very project-based, program-based investments, which I think really is challenging, for the overall health of the sector.
And I'd love to take you back to your book, Scaling Global Challenge. Global Change, Scaling Global Change. This book, I think, was directed to social entrepreneurs who are trying to work through the startup phase and to push to scaled impact. There are obviously a lot of really powerful lessons that you are sharing from your own experience and from what you've learned on the journey. I wonder what you might pull from that book for us. What's relevant from what you wrote in today's world?
Yes, I mean, scaling global change was, a hard fought lessons over 2 decades of growing Room to Read from just an idea to, a global organization working in 15 countries and impacting, over 12 million children, by the time I had left. And it is, I think the lessons that we sort of were trying to communicate and share were, one, it's super important, we found at Room to Read, to be really focused and know what we did best and uniquely, kind of our value add. And in particular, I think that is even more so in a crisis, right? We can't be all things to all people. And so, each of us has a role, to play in the education sector. And do we know what we do, better than most? And it's also a real passion and drive of the organization. And to be very focused on being able to stay true to your mission and not get swayed by too many other activities or pulled in too many directions, because I think that is challenging then for really scaling and growing a nonprofit. So there's certainly that element of focus that I think is very unique to the Room to Read story. I mean, we did early childhood and girls education. We were not trying to be, all things to all people. We were trying to really hone in on our unique value add to the sector. I also think that we were really focused at Room to Read, and a lot of what we talked about is how do we engage and create a movement around the organization. And we saw our partners, our in-country relationships with governments and partners, our donors, chapters around the world that were volunteers that wanted, maybe couldn't write the biggest check, but had a whole lot of feet on the street power to help tell the story. Obviously our global staff, everyone was engaged in this movement, and it was really a collective effort. Everyone had to wear the hat and say, I deeply understand and care about the programs and articulate the power of what Room to Read is doing. And I deeply care about how are we going to raise the resources and tell the story of what we're doing so that everyone can be an advocate and help in fundraising. And, we need people that see both of those roles as part of what they sign up to do. And so I think we were really great at being able to inspire a movement, around the world to care about international education to help support Room to Read. And those were important lessons that we taught about how to engage and communicate and build those fundraising powers, which often are not as well versed, as some of the programmatic strengths that you can find. And people get excited about the programs, but don't always want to understand how do you have to raise the resources to support them. So I think that's a big part of the story of Room to Read too, that we're, how did we do that, and how did we, kind of become a powerhouse, if you will, in fundraising as well as in our programmatic strength. And then I think it was this piece around systems change. We tried to talk about our journey of being an organization that focused, in our early years around just understanding, again, what was our model? How did we have a strong theory of change? How do we measure and be able to articulate from an evidence base what we were seeing working in our programs? But then once we saw that, how could we take that and help share it with others and be a thought leader in the education space, whether that be expansion into new countries, or help train as a technical assistance partner other NGOs on our model, or partner with governments in order to help translate and adapt into their world some of the lessons we were seeing of how to improve the quality of education. Everywhere we saw, it was not just about what can Room to Read do, but it's about how can we be a partner for others to be a part of this global systems change around education. And I think that was the other key part to what we were trying to convey, is that any good social entrepreneur, we know these are complex, huge problems that we're struggling with, and any one organization is not going to be able to solve it. It's more about how do we create, a movement for that change more broadly.
I love that you brought in this idea of movement, and the need for people to collaborate, but also grounding your story and your book around the principles that a good social entrepreneur needs to hold on to. If you think about a government minister, they might not be a social entrepreneur, but they're likely a social entrepreneur in a massive system of change, right? Yeah. Do you think the lessons that you learned from Room to Read that you distilled into this book translate laterally into the government side of social change?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we're seeing the most exciting now is that you're in many places. I can think about in Senegal or in Cambodia, different places. You're seeing some pretty progressive new leaders within education, the Ministry of Education, and seeing them being willing to take risks. Are often younger, well-educated, new ideas that they're bringing into the system themselves, and they're not so the old school government official that we might see being really wedded to traditional ideas. And so I think we are seeing in many ways that very much that entrepreneur, internally in ministries that can bring many of those ideas. And what it really means, oftentimes to be an entrepreneur is being willing to take risks, being willing to try new things and embrace new things, and being willing to accept failure as a learning lesson, right? Maybe the first time you don't get it right, maybe the second time you don't, but you learn something. And how do you fail forward and fail fast in order to learn those lessons, to try something new and not get too wedded to having to always do it the same old way. And so I think those same principles in many cases can be applied to some of the new generation of ministry staff that we're seeing that are willing to embrace a lot of creative pivots and are willing to think about doing things differently. And that's exciting because I think that will help us in many ways, be able to test new systems and new ways of doing things. And at the end of the day, we're, most of us in the education sector are really focused on the fact that the way to reach most children, and certainly most marginalized children, are through the government system. So, we have always been big believers, whether it's at Room to Read or at Echidna, of, helping to create the change from within the system and not create a parallel education system, right? If we're trying to create the change within the government public education system, then we need to be, finding those champions for change and willingness to be creative within the ministries and partnering with them to help them do their job of, really embracing this within the ministry.
A couple more questions for you, Erin. One on this issue of the digital divide. Clearly, as countries are working with large out-of-school populations right now, remote learning is one way to create some level of continuity. But we understand that it's radios, telephones, television screens, whatever it might be, families, children from low-income households will struggle to get access to that sort of technology. And with the protracted crisis, we're going to see the potential for the digital divide to get worse. At the same time, though, to your point about Churchill, various governments and entrepreneurs will continue iterating and innovating around education. Will look to technology to find ways to sort of leapfrog mechanisms that to date may be not effective as they could be in terms of giving kids opportunities. So speak to us about the digital divide and what you see in terms of the costs and risks in a time like this.
Well, I always think with the digital divide, there's a couple things that we don't talk about enough. I mean, I do think we're focused in this crisis, which is really important, on how do we have hybrid models? Because I think we often think of it as an either or, like there's going to be an all online school system over here, and then there's the traditional system over here. And I think those are kind of paralyzing concepts. I think often what we are seeing works best is a combination, right, of using, online and offline models, and also of thinking of technology more appropriate for the communities we're talking about, is not forgetting things like radio, TV, SMS messaging, like, lower levels of technology, right? And so it's really a hybrid model that I think we're all looking for, that is now going to be interesting with all the testing that we're doing and these new ways of staying connected to families and to students. Is how can we keep that going once schools reopen again? Because I think there will be a much more willingness in governments and in NGOs to embrace a lot of these hybrid models. And in some ways, you can think of, whatever's happening in the classroom, if you are able to maintain some of these radio and TV programs, it just reinforces, right? It gives you more time to reinforce messages. Oftentimes you can bring in families to that conversation if they're able to then, with their children, engage in some of the content. It just helps reinforce a lot of what we're, those key learning opportunities. I think the other piece about technology that we don't talk about, first is this hybrid idea. Let's not think of it either or, but the other part of this is that often we only think about it as related to students. And I think the missing piece audience sometimes that's more appropriate is actually the teachers themselves, and even the government and the NGOs that are implementing organizations. Technology has an amazing ability to reduce costs. If we're actually able, if we think about it in our own ways of how do we do, M&E, how do we do data collection, how do we do trainings, how do we do so much, of the bureaucracy around education by using technology more efficiently and effectively through the adults, not just the student population. I think you can see a huge opportunity there to streamline and make more efficient and effective the time that we invest in many of these processes around education that could be reduced by technology, and that is actually a huge opportunity that we haven't really dug in yet. We're still living in many times very archaic systems where it's pencil and paper, and we're collecting data and inputting data and doing all these things that are just take huge amount of resources and time. And so I think that is also something that we should talk about more, because every dollar that is saved could be put into different places in the system. And so it's not only about what access do students have to technology, but it's how do we think about the whole education sector, and how do we modernize and embrace technology in it.
That's good. Okay, so last big one relates to the opportunity cost of rushing through a crisis or panicking our way through a crisis and potentially throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And in this regard, I want to speak to issues related to culture, identity, and local experience in education. If we approach, if our response is somewhat of a picnic blanket that's strewn over entire populations or countries, we may lose the local ingenuity, the local innovation, the local languages, the local experiences that kids need to learn in order to be effective in their societies. What are you seeing? Are we adequately addressing this question of creating learning that allows kids to stand firmly within their own identity and culture, or are we losing ground on that?
That's a hard question, because I think the challenge that we know is that the more localized and contextualized, whether it's children learning in their local language first and then learning in a national language, or in, something like English, later, we know that if it's deeply rooted in the local language first, you then everything else that follows on those basic principles and those basic cognitive development is stronger and better, right? And so I think there's an element of this that are we losing ground or not, is part of it is really understanding at what point in the education life cycle, or do you really want to be very localized and contextualized, and at what point, if you have the basic foundational principles strong, can you maybe embrace some of these broader approaches to learning English or computer science and computer programming, etc. Like all of those are great and can be more standardized in many ways, from a teaching perspective, if you've really had really strong early cognitive development in children and the basic principles are there. So I think it's hard, because I think we're still focused in many cases around the world, as we know, and the learning crisis we have, on getting basic education high quality and delivered in all places. So I still think that is at the heart of where we're at. That's not to say, though, that there isn't opportunities within, as we get older, to rethink secondary education as well, because I think, as we know, as we're talking about with life skills and 21st century skills, there is a lot of opportunity to think about, how do we bring more of that into the quality of what is happening around the world too. And I think there is a equal crisis, if you will, at that level, as we get more children through primary school and into secondary school. How do you make that relevant for children to help it be useful in their lives, in their local communities, but also in whether they want to further their education or, have opportunities outside of school. And so I do think we don't want to lose track of that, because I think there are a lot of great programs now that are really focusing on how do we make secondary education more relevant, for youth as well.
Okay, I'd like to take you back to your own youth, your childhood, and ask you, Erin, what books inspired you as a child?
Well, my first book that I loved the most as a really young child was a book called Me Too, which was all about a little girl who followed her sister everywhere. And I was the younger and had a big sister who I admired. And I think I, read that book on a daily basis for years. But I also was a big fan of the Choose Your Own Adventure series that was popular, where you would, get to a certain page in the book, and then you could choose to go to page, 57 or 107, and you kind of, each time you'd get to an end of a short chapter, you could choose your own path of where you wanted to go. And I think it's interesting about those books is it really set you up, to be able to be open to different paths that we all need to take. And I think that's kind of relevant in my own mind. I've been thinking about that with our, situation here in the pandemic. As each, time new evidence comes or new things that we learn, we, have this opportunity to make different decisions, right? And I think we have to be flexible and resilient and open to continually trying to embrace change throughout this pandemic. And so I think that's, those books are great ways that when I think about, how do we, each time we learn new information and we come to a decision point, there are different options on the table that we can choose from.
Well, Erin, you've been a wonderful guest. You've given us a lot to chew, lots of anecdotes and lessons, and great experience from your journey through education. I wonder whether there's a parting message that you'd like to share with listeners and viewers.
Well, one of the things that I think is really important at this time is that we are, I think, embracing the inequality and the injustices on so many different levels in the world right now, whether they be based on gender or race or class, wealth. I mean, there's so many things that we are seeing are we're being challenged to think about and embrace. Like, is this the world that we want to live in? And to me, I think this is a huge opportunity to realize, there's an intersectionality to all of it, right? And how do we, if we want to live in a different world, how do we create that world now? By embracing the fact that the system is broken, we've reached a level of chaos and challenges that we've never seen on the planet before. Whether it's a combination of, coronavirus and the economic challenges we're facing, the climate change challenges we're facing. I mean, at every level, we are in a state of crisis. And to me, can we embrace this moment and think about how do we create the more equal and just world that we all want to live in now and not later? And how do we think about the intersectionality of all of these? And if the system is broken on so many different levels, is there a way to build back on a system that is really on a stronger footing, that is rooted in the real values and beliefs of the world that we want to live in?
And thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me.